Welcome, everyone, to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Series, weekly discussions of practice and science by experts in behavioral health and the law. This is a series hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, along with the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. I'm Anthony Perillo, the Forensic Psychology Training Director here in the Division of Forensic Behavioral Sciences at the University of New Mexico. For our talk today, if you have any questions for our presenter, make sure you enter them in the Q&A box. You can enter them anytime you feel comfortable during the talk, but do know that we hold questions until the end. Oftentimes, it's not possible for us to get to all of them. If you are pursuing continuing medical education credits, there will be a sign-in sheet posted in the chat box shortly. For those of you pursuing APA continuing education credits, that link will also be posted in the chat box, but in the latter portions of the talk, so keep your eye on the chat box as the talk is coming to a close. Make sure you open that link before the webinar ends, save it if it's not working for you at that time, and make sure you download a copy of your certificate afterwards because we don't have access to the completed survey certificates after the fact. As a heads up, a recording and link and PowerPoint slides should be available sometime later this week for this talk. And for next week's talk in the series, we have Dr. Rayanne Anderson, who will be discussing disclosure and equity issues when assessing issues related to sexual victimization. But circling back to this week, I'm really pumped to introduce you to today's speaker. We'll be discussing considerations of anti-Blackness, trauma, and mitigation additional harm when doing risk evaluations for legally involved youth. This is Dr. Jeanne McPhee. Dr. Jeanne McPhee is a licensed psychologist and a National Institute of Mental Health postdoctoral scholar in the Juvenile and Justice Behavioral Health Lab at the University of California, San Francisco. She has a Ph.D. in clinical psychology from Drexel University with a focus in forensic psychology. Her research focuses on promoting positive outcomes for legally involved youth by adapting and implementing evidence-based assessment and treatment policies for youth, their families and communities, and within the larger systems that they come into contact with, such as the legal system. I know I came across her work in psychology's role in anti-Blackness and legal and mental health systems at last year's APLS at a completely packed session, and I'm just really excited for her sharing the work that she and her colleagues have been doing in this area. Dr. McPhee, Jeanne, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, we're very excited to have you joining this series and very thankful for you sharing this expertise in a really helpful, critical issue for us to consider. I will go ahead and throw it over to you.
Thank you so much. They tell you not to look at how many people are here, and I did. So now I'm a little bit nervous and just putting that out there for everybody, but I'm really excited that everybody is here. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Please let me know if for some reason you can't see the slides here. Give me 1 second. Okay. All right. So I really appreciate that everyone's joining me today to talk about evaluating and framing risk and forensic evaluations of legally involved youth through the careful considerations of anti-Blackness, trauma, and mitigating further harm. As Dr. Perillo mentioned, I'm Jeanne McPhee. I'm a National Institutes of Mental Health T32 postdoctoral scholar in the Juvenile and Justice and Behavioral Health Lab at the University of California, San Francisco. Before I get started with my talk, I want to acknowledge the identity and the positionality that I bring to this talk and that I bring to the work that I do. So I'm a white woman, I'm trained in clinical forensic psychology, and I do not have any previous legal experience. I note this because I have immense privilege to do the work that I do, and I have had the opportunity to learn from so many who do not have the same identities that I do, and who have not necessarily been afforded the same privileges that I have. I also want to recognize that as a part of my work, I'm constantly striving to learn more and do better as someone who shares identities with the vast majority of our field. So please take the work that I'm talking about here today as just one step in what I hope is a career-long journey of learning. Okay, before we get started, just some information here about how to receive your continuing education credits. As Dr. Perillo mentioned, there will be some links for you to fill out shortly throughout the presentation. I don't have any financial disclosures to let you all know about. However, I am, as I mentioned, funded by the NIMH for my position at UCSF. And as a disclaimer, the views in my presentation are those of myself and they don't necessarily represent the views and policies and positions of the University of New Mexico or the University of California, San Francisco. So today we're going to talk about 3 problems with juvenile risk assessment practices that can maintain historic harm, specifically for Black youth. We'll first discuss a brief history of our field to understand where many of these practices come from and illuminate some of these problems. And then we'll talk about trauma and how the lack of trauma-informed practice harms Black youth. Throughout, I'll provide 6 recommendations to improve forensic evaluation and report writing to mitigate and reduce harm for Black youth. So calling back to what I mentioned when I first began, what I'll present today is an amalgamation of work that I've done with incredible colleagues over the last few years. I want to acknowledge the immense work that they have put into these various projects, the dissertation that I wrote, clinical evaluations and training that I have done, my internship program, and various manuscripts on the topic. I also want to acknowledge that there were several organizations that were really essential in helping me recruit judges and probation officers for my dissertation, part of which I will share today. So let's begin by recognizing together the first issue. Our field has a racist history that our practices continue to perpetuate. I want to draw your attention to a paper that goes into much more depth than I have space to do today on our field's, the history of our field's contributions to anti-Blackness. This is in the perspective on psychological science. And if you need a copy and can't access it for free online, please reach out to me. I will happily provide this to you. This was a labor of love from a number of folks who really wanted to think critically about how our field was created and what kind of contributions we're still lending. So the overall rate of incarceration and racial inequity in incarceration stem in part from our country's longstanding punitive stance towards Black populations. There have been a number of efforts to oppress and control Black people in the United States, and these efforts played an important role in shaping definitions of and institutional responses to mental illness and crime. In fact, mental illness offered a tool for social control. In the Western world, the field of psychiatry historically concerned itself with surveilling and controlling the minds and bodies of people who were deemed other. Black people in particular bore the brunt of this surveillance and control within the United States, where the political economy relied heavily on the enslavement and the dehumanization of African peoples. The perceived inferiority of Black people guided the development of psychology and its use of these communities within Western capitalism and white supremacy. Psychology's complicity with this oppression can be seen in its conceptual roots of psychiatry and psychology, from Carl Jung's beliefs that African peoples were devoid of coherent consciousness, to G. Stanley Hall's conception that criminality was firmly rooted in the mind of African people. The concepts of sanity and Blackness in the United States are so historically intertwined that scholars have argued that within the United States' cultural zeitgeist, there's no Blackness without madness, nor madness without Blackness. For example, in 1840, the US Census report inaccurately reported that free Black people were 10 times more likely to be considered insane compared with Black people who were enslaved. These data were intentionally fabricated to argue that the psyche of Black people was incapable of handling freedom and would justify the continued enslavement of Black people. In 1851, Dr. Samuel Cartwright published an article in which he claimed to have identified a new mental health disorder specific to Black people, known as drapetomania. Cartwright described drapetomania as a form of mania that manifested as an uncontrollable desire to run away from the white master. Such racism continued to guide the development and application of psychological diagnoses for nearly 2 centuries and required an additional enforced enslavement on a plantation or institution for Black people. As US states broadly adopted eugenicist policies, such as forced sterilization, the policies held up broad conceptions of Black people among other minoritized groups as naturally inferior and harmful to the advancement of Western civilization. Black people were disproportionately diagnosed with ill-fitting diagnoses on the basis of tests intentionally designed to demonstrate white biological and cultural superiority. These diagnoses led to the institutional hospitalization and sterilization of Black people. Anti-Black diagnoses continued to be wielded politically, and towards the end of the 20th century, they were used specifically to pathologize Black protest movements and Black political leaders. For example, protest psychosis was conceptualized to describe Black people who were observed in an inpatient hospital who were active members of radical Black protests. The treatment for such psychosis was to continue the institutionalization of folks who were active in those Black protest movements. Racism has continued to shift how diagnoses were conceived and still affects Black people in our present day. So let's think about, even when Black and white people present with similar symptoms, Black people are significantly more likely than white people to be diagnosed with psychotic disorders and disruptive behavior disorders, whereas white people are more likely to be diagnosed with mood disorders. We know that there's an intense stigma with psychotic and disruptive behavior disorders, and this is clearly an indication of racism. These racial biases in diagnoses are especially alarming because psychotic symptoms, even when below a clinical threshold, are associated with substantially heightened rates of incarceration and involuntary hospitalization. Recent research has also demonstrated that specifically for Black people, the presence of symptoms associated with psychotic disorders, things like talking to oneself loudly, having quote unquote erratic behaviors, is associated with increased public support for the use of police force. In contrast, for white people with the same symptoms, the perceived presence of these symptoms serves as a protective factor and is associated with decreased public support for the use of public violence. Within our field's research, there have been clear demonstrations of attempts to link Blackness, especially youthful Blackness, to criminal, aggressive, or violent traits, often under the guise of assessing biological factors or violence and criminal behavior. Most often, in the implications of research, authors blame youth for their behaviors. So let's think about skipping school and Black parents and communities for not exercising control over their youngest community members. At the same time, you'll rarely find in any discussion of these research articles any considerations of context and systemic barriers facing Black families and communities. And yet, there are many systemic barriers and contexts that require consideration. So let's go back to our example here of Black youth skipping school. Consider that despite segregation being ruled unconstitutional in 1954 and strides made towards equitable access to educational opportunities among Black communities, biases persisted and still do today that negatively affect the experiences of Black youth in school settings. For example, research has shown that lower expectations of Black youth have been shown to negatively influence engagement in school and educational outcomes. We also know that Black youth experience disproportionate school punishment in terms of both frequency and extent of punishment relative to their white peers who exhibit similar or even worse behaviors in class. And importantly, Black youth face inequitable distribution of school resources. One example is that research has shown Black youth are selected at lower rates for talented and gifted programs, and that these programs are less common in Black communities. And while we'd like to think that these are issues of the past, that would really be a mistake here. These types of studies are still being conducted and published today. The discrimination and racism may be slightly less overt, but it's still present in the methodologies and the designs that are perpetuating racist beliefs. So for example, in 2020, there was a study done in the Journal of Intelligence reporting findings linking lower IQ scores with increases in behavioral problems among a sample of almost entirely racially and ethnically minoritized youth from low-income families. Another study done in 2020 in the Journal of Sexual Assault chose to use a dichotomous race and ethnicity variable where they pitted white versus non-white and reported that non-white adolescents were more likely to be early onset sexual offenders. Needless to say, these studies are flawed in terms of their design, in terms of their statistical analyses and reporting of the results, and these designs perpetuate racist beliefs across the field and, you can imagine, across the courts. So these trends that I've reviewed illustrate how negligence and active discrimination in the field of psychology have contributed to the conceptualization of Black people as criminals, or that their behavior, which could be explained potentially by mental health concerns, is delinquent or criminal. Perhaps most important for us to all chew on and take from this is how these ideas rapidly spread from our academic silos to public perception and opinion. We have and continue to play active and passive roles in advancing these harmful narratives in ways that deeply impact Black communities everywhere. It's our responsibility to work diligently to mitigate the harm for future generations and advance science to help heal living generations who have been negatively impacted. So we should consider how we, as forensic evaluators who work with youth, especially Black youth, contribute to this model and how our contributions can lead to serious societal consequences for young people. The system in which we work and interact, the juvenile legal system and child welfare systems, are steeped with white supremacist and structurally racist policies. We are then often asked to provide diagnostic information and risk assessments defining the likelihood of future crime within our forensic evaluations, which all have really serious implications and can affect legal opinions and outcomes for youth at a high rate. So I've named the problem, I've gone through some history. What do we do about it? There are actionable steps that we can all take. Part of this paper that I mentioned, we actually offer recommendations beyond just the forensic evaluation context. So feel free to take a look at those, especially if you are conducting your own research or you're involved in any kind of therapeutic context. But I'll highlight many of the forensic evaluation contexts today throughout this presentation. So first, it's important that we do not attempt to remain colorblind out of a desire to be objective. In fact, doing that does not make us objective and can especially be harmful to the individuals with whom we work by demonstrating an increase in our racial bias and a reduction in trust legitimacy of evaluators by Black individuals. All evaluators and evaluees have multiple identities that intersect, things like gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, and religion. The race and ethnicity and culture of the evaluator, along with the power dynamic of the evaluation process, is likely to influence the evaluee before we even open our mouths. The dynamics here can be varied and complex, as the evaluee may view the evaluator as one of us or one of them, along with any number of categories. Instead, we should aim to minimize the racial bias in our evaluations and in decisions made with our recommendations by contextualizing what we present. This is key, and I will come back to it many times in my recommendations here. We might consider using specialized risk assessment measures that we think are race neutral, right? That they don't provide information that's systematically different by race or ethnicity. But there are systemic biases influencing decisions to arrest in most communities, which we'll talk more about shortly. So showing comparable percentages of white and Black youth that are given a specific risk category, for example, would be misleading. So instead, it seems that we should really be using what we consider race-informed information in our guiding considerations. Review your own conclusions. Reduce the subjectivity of your conclusions by looking at the data that you collected with a contextual lens. Consider what other sources of bias against Black youth could provide a broader context and may influence decisions appropriately. In addition, participate in cultural competency training, especially those that are provided specifically for assessors and evaluators, as testing materials have their own biases and cultural considerations. Encourage the increase and the use of community-based alternatives to confinement accessible to Black youth and their communities nearby. And finally, recognize and describe barriers to family involvement that Black youth may experience that may bias the court's perception of the youth's compliance or success. The next recommendation is to be thoughtful and to be intentional with describing the youth's race and ethnicity in the background of your report. As colleagues in our field, Dr. Riggs-Romaine and Kavanaugh suggest, always ask, sometimes write. It's important to our culturally competent practice that we ask questions about race, ethnicity, culture, and level of acculturation. These questions may highlight important issues that would not have otherwise been raised. So for example, if an evaluee's self-identification may not fit with his or her or their appearance. However, what is learned from these questions may or may not be relevant to the legal question and current forensic evaluation. Carefully consider whether or not to include this information in your written report, and be sure that this information won't instead provide opportunity for bias from the court. In cases where your decision is that it's important the young person's identities is relevant, describe a client's race and ethnic backgrounds in a historical and background section of a report in a manner similar to discussing a history of trauma or information about an individual's community or housing, rather than what we have all been trained to do with our one line, this is this person's name, race, age, and gender. Okay, let's move on to our second problem. Trauma in Black youth is highly prevalent and yet misdiagnosed in forensic evaluations. As we consider our roles in forensic evaluation, we must recognize the important patterns in the communities that we work with. In the United States, Black children are disproportionately burdened with adverse life experiences compared to white children. Nationally, 1 in 3 Black non-Hispanic children have experienced 2 to 8 ACEs, compared to only 1 in 5 white non-Hispanic children. Research suggests that Black children are more likely to be exposed to trauma and domestic violence, and are more likely to have a parent who died, an incarcerated parent, or divorced and separated parents compared to white children. Also, research has shown that Black children live in disproportionately disadvantaged neighborhoods and are more likely than white children to have been exposed to neighborhood violence. These racial disparities are not random. Rather, they are deep-rooted structural inequalities that result from a history of disenfranchisement of racially minoritized groups that reinforce themselves through societal norms and practices. And we know that these structural inequalities extend well into the juvenile legal system, with Black youth disproportionately arrested, detained, and incarcerated, each of which can be traumatizing in and of themselves. We also know that while Black youth have disproportionate exposure to trauma, they're also more often misdiagnosed. Specifically, they're more likely to be diagnosed with externalizing disorders, even when trauma exposure is present and could better explain the symptoms. This is important to note, given that oftentimes trauma symptoms can be expressed as externalizing symptoms that may be considered problem behaviors and are disciplined or considered delinquent. Research shows across the educational and legal systems that Black youth disproportionately receive punishment for externalizing behaviors or problematic classroom behavior. And despite what we know about legal involvement being traumatizing for youth, especially for Black youth and youth of color, generally trauma is missed completely or is misdiagnosed within the context of forensic evaluations. On top of the misdiagnosis of trauma, assessment of race-based traumatic stress is not consistently assessed in the lives of legally involved youth. There are real critical gaps preventing the accurate assessment and diagnosis of race-based traumatic stress and symptoms in youth. First being that exposure to race-based traumatic stress in youth is currently assessed with measures of constructs that are related to but distinct from race-based traumatic stress. So these constructs may be an assessment of racial discrimination or racial socialization, but not specifically race-based traumatic stress. Also, these measures capture exposure to racism-related events, but do not necessarily capture traumatic stress responses to these experiences. We're getting at exposure, we're not getting at symptoms. Really importantly, there's not a single current validated published measure that assesses race-based traumatic stress symptoms in youth, underscoring a key shortcoming in research and clinical practice. The first and only measure of race-based traumatic stress symptoms in youth of color specifically was recently developed and is awaiting review and publication as we speak. Instead, race-based traumatic stress measures have been developed for and validated on adults, which at times then are applied to youth. But we know that youth and adults don't have similar experiences and may not understand questions that were then validated for adults. In a forthcoming paper in the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, we discuss these issues from an assessment and diagnostic lens, as well as from a therapeutic standpoint, and put together a list of measures currently being used in some way to measure the exposure and the symptomology of race-based traumatic stress and its related constructs. We also describe if the tool is currently being used with or validated in youth. We offer several recommendations for providers. And so if you are a forensic evaluator looking to add a race-based traumatic stress measure to your battery, feel free to take a look at this paper and pick one that seems like it would fit well for you. So given all that we know about the misdiagnosis and missed diagnosis of trauma, it's important that we as forensic evaluators specifically include and report on an assessment of trauma that we ourselves conduct in our evaluation. First, we have to specifically assess for trauma, including systemic and discrimination-based trauma. Our suggestion here is to use a general trauma screener that's been validated with youth populations and that asks specifically about experiences with racism. So you may consider using the PEARLS tool, which looks at the expanded ACEs, including racism and discrimination-based trauma. In addition, you should potentially add a measure of a related construct, such as the perceptions of racism in children and youth, so that you can better understand the symptomology that young people are experiencing. It's also important that you use a measure that captures trauma symptoms on a validated measure for youth, such as the CATS or the UCLA PTSD Reaction Index, in addition to your broad diagnostic measures. Within your report, it's important to describe your results of the trauma measure in detail. Describe the symptomology explicitly, as often symptoms of trauma can come up throughout court involvement and can sometimes be seen as delinquent behavior. I'll give an example of a client that I had who had an intense trauma history and would often run away from home, would cut off her ankle monitor when she was feeling triggered. This to the court looked like she was non-compliant. And so without a real understanding of her experience of trauma and her symptomology, there was no real consideration of what this might be in terms of her adaptive behavior, given her trauma experience. Next, for those with trauma symptoms or who are in need of specific trauma treatment, be explicit about how risk assessment-based needs are affected by or could be treated with trauma treatment. Focus on the dynamic risks and needs that an evidence-based trauma treatment could improve. Finally, include specific information to treatment for behavioral health concerns that also falls into the psycholegal question at hand. Remember that our legal practitioner colleagues may have limited knowledge about specific treatments and how these treatments can improve the issues for the young person in front of you. I'm going to give an example here. This is shout out to UC Davis Care Center and my internship experience. Here's a part of a juvenile sex offender risk evaluation that I conducted while on internship. And after conducting an assessment that included specific trauma measures, we provided specific information about evidence-based treatment for the presenting behavioral health concern that would also reduce sexually inappropriate behavior. And we provided treatment specific to the youth sexual behavior, which was obviously the question at hand for the court. So we were explicit about the goals of TFCBT, and we discussed how TFCBT could address this young person's history of abuse and their inappropriate sexual behaviors. We also then went on to provide additional information about treatments that could address other legal risks and needs that were requested by the court. This really doesn't take up an inordinate amount of space in your report. You can see that this is a paragraph and a half here, and yet this could really benefit the young people that we're working with and we're evaluating, because it gives potential future treatment providers a roadmap for specific goals and target areas. It also increases the chances that the court recommends a specific kind of therapy. I'm sure many of us have given evaluations and have learned that the recommendation from the court is just to go to therapy. But instead, we can be really specific about what kind of therapy are we suggesting, why are we suggesting it, and how does it draw back to somebody's experience of trauma and their legal risks and needs. Okay, on to our final problem for today's talk. Juvenile risk assessments themselves are flawed. Given that many of our jobs require us to perform risk assessments, we'll focus now on where our risk assessments can go awry if we're not intentional and careful. Juvenile risk assessments were intentionally created by fusing together adult risk assessments with research findings for young people. The goal of these risk assessments was to evaluate a youth's, is generally to evaluate a youth's potential for future offending and violence. And at this point, risk assessments have proliferated across states and jurisdictions, and they are being done at many points of case processing, even before we have an opportunity to conduct a risk assessment. Many of the tools assess these central 8 factors, going back to Bonta and Andrews, things like the criminal history, education and employment factors, family, substance use, leisure activities, peer relations, attitudes and orientation towards crime, and personality and behavior. Yet these risk assessments are flawed. Many risk assessment measures have been considered by scholars and policymakers to invalidly appraise risk for youth of color, overestimating their probability of recidivism. Some literature suggests that race moderates the relationship between risk category and recidivism, with risk tools demonstrating better predictive validity for white youth than for Black youth. It's important also that we consider and recognize the ways in which risk assessment measures operationalize the term recidivism. Are we thinking rearrest here? Does this measure take into consideration self-reported reoffending? Because each of these different definitions can further exacerbate validity concerns. Youth of color, particularly Black youth, more often live in communities with greater police presence than white youth, and therefore are at a greater risk of arrest and rearrest than white youth, even when the rates of such behaviors are equal between Black and white youth. So risk assessment tools with rearrest as the outcome may not accurately predict levels of reoffending for Black youth. Moreover, risk assessment measures often rely on static factors, things like criminal history or early antisocial behavior, that are inherently racially biased. Let's take, for example, the variable that's often used, one of our very first checkboxes, previous arrests. Given that Black folks are more likely to be arrested compared to white individuals who commit similar crimes, this variable potentially biases the conclusions of the risk assessment measure. In addition, some risk assessment measures assign risk based on variables that have historically served as proxies for race, such as the presence of a single-parent home. The construct validity of such risk assessment measures can and should be called into question, as anti-Black racism contributes to disproportionate variance across racial groups. However, we still use these assessments, so we need to consider how we're using them and how they're interpreted. Social science research has demonstrated that perceptions of risk generally are biased. Judges' decision-making, for example, is influenced by their perceptual biases about mortality, with judges involved in negligence decisions overvaluing the probability of low likelihood but catastrophic events and underemphasizing high probability low loss events. Research with juvenile probation officers indicated that without the use of a structured risk assessment tool, probation officers tended to overestimate the base rates of reoffending among youth. Jurors, too, tend to overestimate recidivism risk in adult sexual offenders, especially when provided with higher categorical risk levels. The use of heuristics to guide decision-making can be prevented, however. So, for instance, researchers have found that if we present data from structured risk assessment measures, it will reduce the use of judges' perceptual shortcuts and heuristics about a youth or an offense when making detention decisions and decreases the number of youth who are ordered to detention. So as a part of my dissertation, I experimentally tested this. I used a randomized vignette survey design and asked juvenile and family court judges, court officers, and juvenile probation officers to estimate the likelihood that a 15-year-old would commit another crime based on the risk level randomly assigned to each participant. The risk level of the youth was the thing that changed between participants, and probation officers and judges were asked to give a % likelihood that the youth would commit another crime in the next year. This study was recently published in Law and Human Behavior. If you're interested in reading more about it, there were far more aims than I'm willing to get into today. But what I found was that there was a significant difference among participants' perceptions of a youth's likelihood to commit another crime based solely on their risk level. The estimates of recidivism followed the expected pattern that they believed a low-risk youth had a significantly lower likelihood to recidivate than moderate, high, and very high-risk youth. More importantly, though, there was a really wide spread of recidivism estimations in each risk level group, ranging from 0 to 50% likelihood of reoffending in the low risk group, and up to 80 and 90% in the moderate, high, and very high risk group, demonstrating that legal decision makers have really idiosyncratic interpretations of risk category. This is really important for us to recognize because it means that our risk assessment conclusions may not be consistently understood by legal practitioners and may instead fall into a heuristic or a guide that they then use in their decision-making process. So what do we do, knowing that the risk assessments that we use may not be consistently appraising risk for Black youth, nor are they interpreted consistently across all youth. Let's start by not relying on risk category to do all the work. Instead, we should describe relevant risks and needs beyond the use of just the risk assessment measure, especially considering areas in which risk assessment measures may overestimate risk based on race. Provide diagnostic information and, where applicable, the potential risks of restrictive interventions on behavioral health symptomology and law-abiding behaviors. Offer specific information on effective behavioral health interventions and the rationale for why you're recommending these particular interventions. And of course, provide information about the risk level, but with that, describe the specific risks and needs appropriate to the youth's risk level. Don't just stick with this is a low risk kid or a moderate risk kid. Be intentional and be explicit about what areas could make for improvement in the youth's life. Given that the assignment of risk and resulting legal outcomes from these assessments rely on factors that are likely biased against Black communities, we as forensic psychologists should be especially critical of the potential mischaracterization and overcriminalization of the Black youth that we are evaluating. This is not to diminish the value of the information provided structured approaches to risk assessment. Instead, the use of greater structure on decision-making, including risk and needs assessment, can facilitate the identification and reduction of different forms of racial and ethnic bias. So our risk assessment recommendation must move beyond considering individual risk level and risk reduction strategies to include consideration of systemic obstacles to risk reduction, such as disparities in high-quality intervention services between predominantly white and Black neighborhoods, challenges to single low-income working parents in attending family intervention sessions. We have to consider things like parental incarceration, parental behavioral health needs, transportation challenges, childcare needs, and physical mobility challenges. In addition, we must consider the risks and needs of an individual client in light of systemic factors that could contribute to recidivism in particular, and to further penetration into the legal system, such as community policing. We also must consider where we place our emphasis within our evaluations and reports. Risk assessment measures often rely on those static factors that are inherently racially biased. And there are some variables, primarily static historical variables involving contact with law enforcement and the legal system, that have racial bias embedded to the extent that we cannot meaningfully estimate it. So focusing on these static variables in our risk assessment and in our reports will likely include the influence of racial bias, and does not allow the evaluator, us as evaluators, to propose compensatory strategies for minimizing bias. So instead, we should offer context for the static variables, identifying things that are beyond the control of the youth and that will remain unchanged regardless of the level of intervention provided. By contrast, we should place the emphasis on the dynamic variables that involve the application of services to identified needs, things like substance use treatment, family therapy, then existing racial disparities in services that are available. The existing racial disparity in services availability are more obvious and can be addressed through intensive planning and provision efforts as a collaboration between the court and the family. So I have covered a lot today. I've covered 3 different problems that we as a field have. First being that our field has a racist history that our practices, if left unchanged, can continue to perpetuate. We also know that trauma in Black youth is highly prevalent and yet misdiagnosed in forensic evaluation, which can lead to a misunderstanding of risks and needs. And juvenile risk assessments are flawed and need significant context to address in individual evaluations. And we went through some of these recommendations. There are many, many more out there published by our colleagues, and I appreciate that we were able to take some of these and expand upon them. So big shout out to our academic family in this space. But it's important that we be intentional when describing information about a client's race and ethnic backgrounds in the historical and background sections of a report. Include the information in a matter similar to discussing history of trauma or information about an individual's community, rather than including it as a one-liner of identifiers. Be objective, but don't be blind. Don't attempt to remain colorblind just because you might think that that makes you objective. Instead, we know that that could make for more harm for the individuals with whom we work. Include and report an assessment of trauma, including race-based traumatic stress, and consider recommendations focused on reducing further bias and traumatization of Black youth. Describe relevant risks and needs beyond the use of a risk assessment measure, especially considering areas in which risk assessment measures may overestimate risk based on race. For more information about this, I really would encourage you all to read Dr. Riggs, Romaine, and Kavanaugh's 2019 paper on this. I think it was incredibly helpful and very practical to considering how should we actually discuss risks and needs within our evaluations. Consider the risks and needs of the youth that we're working with and of the individual clients in light of systemic factors that can contribute to recidivism and that can contribute to further penetration into the legal system. And consider these when you're writing your reports too. Acknowledge that systemic factors are things that should be written into reports. And finally, acknowledge the biases in risk assessment measures and in their interpretation. Emphasize dynamic factors that can improve with intervention, and describe what a risk assessment measure really offers to the court. So to finish up here, we must recognize the power and responsibility as researchers, as mental health providers, as forensic evaluators to interrupt the criminalization and pathologizing of Blackness. Although it may be tempting to delay action, it may feel like other people could do this, maybe the next generation of forensic evaluators. Our ethical principles of our profession implore that we make substantial change now that we recognize there's a problem. The recommendations that I've provided here are not exhaustive and they're not perfect. I hope simply that they're a starting point to have more conversations with everyone in our field about how we might continue to combat anti-Blackness in our everyday practice and largely across our field. That is all I have for everybody. I have tons of references that will be in here. And I have the link and the evaluation code, and I appreciate everyone's time.
Yes, and thank you so much, Dr. McPhee, Jeanne, for that thorough background and explanation of a lot of considerations that we can give in attempting to make our services better and to promote racial considerations, culturally humble approaches to forensic practice, and our role and responsibilities in continued racism perpetuation in the work that we do. And thank you so much for addressing all of that. Some have asked if you could put the QR code up again for just a second so that they can access that. In the meantime, those links are also in the chat box. Make sure you check the chat box, open that. If the links don't work, save it for later. It should work for you at some point here. In the meantime, we do have several questions here. The slides will be available for people sometime later this week. I have several people asking about that. And we also had several people that have asked this question. I've seen it on similar talks before, where you did reference the recommendation against moving away from one-liner descriptions of race and ethnicity in reports. Offhand, do you have any particular examples of phrasing or the types of things you're talking about that might help expand upon a discussion of race or ethnicity in a historical or background section?
Yeah, it's a great question. Honestly, I thought about that like about 5 minutes before this presentation, that I should have pulled that from a recent report. My suggestion is, really think intentionally about what does that one-liner do for the person who's reading this evaluation and report, right? That is the very first thing that somebody sees. And so there may then be some biasing that happens just in acknowledging who this person is, what their race and ethnicity is, what their gender, what their race is. Instead, the suggestion that I have is to consider how you might talk about culture. And if you don't currently have a section in your forensic evaluations about culture, I would implore you to add one. So what this might look like is instead describing what the family culture is, what religion looks like. If there are matters about identity that came up in the evaluation, that it was really important for this client to share their experience of being a Black person or a Black young person. It might come up in the context of when they were arrested. I think there's there's often a drive and a desire to be as objective as possible for the court, and that in some ways dehumanizes the people that we're working with. So instead, as you're thinking about how you might describe the community in which they grew up, right, or their family history, you might add in details about their other identities that are relevant and to the legal question at hand. So you might think about, what does the family dynamic look like? What does the family structure look like? Having a putting in there information about is a family member incarcerated, and what the young person's experience was of that, right? Not just saying that they have, an incarcerated parent, but having a more open conversation within your interview about what those kinds of things have affected for young people.
Wonderful. Thank you for those considerations there. Somebody asked, what is your opinion regarding the use of items in forensic risk measures that assess, quote unquote, age-appropriate capacities for empathy and remorse with minoritized versus white youth? This person adds, for their context, I always find these items to be deeply subjective and difficult to assess with many youth, as they can be very culturally and contextually bound.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I hear that. I think, first of all, I just want to applaud the fact that you are already recognizing this is not, these measures are not perfect, right? And that we in ourselves, as we're evaluating young people and are asking these questions, are recognizing, hey, this might not actually be capturing everything that's going on for this young person. So I would actually recommend that you give context. I mean, I'll be sick of me saying that at the end of this talk, because I think what's so important and what risk assessment measures often leave out is the context, right? So if the developmental questions around what empathy looks like for young people is going to look very different for a Black youth whose family doesn't, describe their emotions the same way another person's family might, give that context. We don't need to just have a checkbox from these risk assessments, but instead we can describe where some of this either could have come from or where the young person reports themselves where this came from. We can ask follow-up questions, and I think the important thing is to ask those questions so that you can then write about it, and write about it using quotations specifically from the young person.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Along the lines of assessment tools, somebody asked about, are there particular assessment tools or articles that you would recommend somebody starting with in terms of how to implement this into their practice?
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Riggs-Romaine and Kavanaugh published a paper in 2019 where they specifically talked about how to consider and write about risks and needs in forensic evaluation context. It was not just with youth, I think it was with adults too, and it was incredibly practical. As an early career person, I love a practical paper. I love when somebody tells me, here's what to consider and here's how to think about it. So definitely look at that one. The paper that we wrote all together, that I will find, because I think somebody asked for the citation again, this paper, in our recommendations, we have a whole recommendation section where we also go into what some of these recommendations are in terms of thinking about risk assessments, right? Which risk assessment are we using? Are we going to use the VRAG, which has these sort of proxies for race, where we're talking about single parent households, or are we thinking about ones that offer opportunities for more context, right? Are we thinking about something that is not just check boxes, but maybe something like the YLS CMI, where at least there's an opportunity for you to add follow-up contextual information? Again, it really depends on your jurisdiction and your practice, but I think just recognizing that we can ask the follow-up questions, and should, if we're really trying to make sure that we're giving young people an opportunity to expand on their experience, not just what the risk assessment tells us we must ask and have a yes or no answer to. The other one that I will mention that I actually have to find again, the APLS Practice Committee, I think in 2021, wrote out guidelines specifically for talking about race and ethnicity within forensic evaluation context. I do know it was the APLS Practice Committee, and I do know it was in 2021. If I can find it after this, I'm happy to put it with the slides so that you all have access to it also.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. Somebody asked, they were referencing a graph that you showed from your dissertation work. Wanted to make sure they understood that the high risk category was interpreted as having somewhere from 0 to 90% likelihood of reoffending. And if that's so, How can variance be that high and still be useful for understanding a risk category?
I actually think you're getting at the heart of the problem here, right? So there was a mean of 55%, right? So that there was across the whole group who had the very high risk category, the mean was 55% likely that they were going to recidivate. But we had as low as 3 and as high as 91%. I looked at this across judges, across probation officers. There weren't really major differences between judges, like the group of judges and group of probation officers who had this. But you're getting at the heart of the problem here that like all of these folks have the opportunity to make decisions. And my dissertation specifically was about detention, right? Would they revoke probation and detain this kid or incarcerate this kid? And you can imagine, right? If you're working with a judge who has this heuristic, this shortcut that very high risk kids have a 91% likelihood of recidivating, then you would imagine that judge is going to be incarcerating very high risk kids left and right. Those kids also, maybe this is not true in every jurisdiction, but certainly in the ones that I've worked with, not every kid has the same judge at every hearing. And so these kids might be going from a judge who has this like really high estimation of recidivism to one that has a really low, and there's really no procedural justice then for these kids with this inconsistency of how am I going to get treated today by this judge, regardless of the fact that the risk level hasn't changed. So that variability is in and of itself the problem here. And so that is why my recommendation is don't just list the risk category, because that may mean very different things to very different practitioners who are working with youth. Instead, list the risk category as we do and provide some context, really spell out what the risks and needs are, and spell out the risks and needs that are especially dynamic and actually responsive to intervention. There's nothing we can do at this point about a family member who's incarcerated. Right? That's not going to change for this kid. They have a history of having a family member incarcerated. But does this kid have substance use needs? Well, then let's talk about that one, and let's actually provide some opportunity for intervention here.
This really does highlight the work, role, and responsibilities that evaluators, we at the forefront have in all of these efforts. And I really appreciate you framing it with that perspective there.
Yeah, and I think also that's really complicated. And I will say this again, really early career forensic evaluator, sometimes I have trouble distinguishing sort of what's my role in what I'm writing. How much sort of leeway do I have in writing? Because the intention is not to advocate, right? But we're not advocating by providing context. We're just giving more information, and judges and probation officers and anybody who's looking at our risk assessments can do this, can make the decision that they'll make. But if we can provide context, it may affect the decision maker a little bit differently, or it may provide the youth an opportunity to get their voice back into the evaluation.
Certainly. Thank you for that. One last question here as we wrap up, is how do you address trauma and ACEs within the context of an aggravating or mitigating factor in a risk assessment?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think I would love there to be like one recommendation that I have. I would love there to be like, here you go, like this is just the one recommendation here for how we do this. What I will say is that I think it's really important that we acknowledge trauma and ACEs within our evaluations. I think that our field / the world is getting better at recognizing that trauma has effects on people. And so sometimes trauma and ACEs are both, right? Sometimes they're both an aggravating and a mitigating effect. They have both aggravating and mitigating effects. And I think it's important that you provide the context for potentially what those are on both sides, right? That we're not just saying this kid has a history of sexual abuse, right? And that they have, been modeled what appropriate sexual behavior is. It's actually inappropriate. But we can also recognize then within talking about how that's modeled, that there are interventions that are really good for remodeling what appropriate sexual behaviors are. And so again, I think it's really just a matter of let's point out what's actually happening here and then give context and give intervention opportunities that we know actually work.
Dr. McPhee, Jeanne, thank you so much for all of these expansive conceptual and practical considerations for us as forensic evaluators and thinking about the role that we have in such a critical issue. Thank you for sharing your expertise here with all of us. That wraps up this week's Law and Mental Health series. We hope to see you next time when Dr. Rayanne Anderson will be discussing disclosure and equity issues related to assessing sexual victimization. Until next time, I hope you have a fantastic rest of the week and take care.